Hello guys, good afternoon. So this is going to be the second part of the unique American literature topic. And the previous one was the background. That was very important to set the mood and to set the conversation topic. So today we're gonna start talking about the writers of prose, and also in the third part, that is going to be a second video, we're gonna talk about the writers of verse. So today, because of many things that I needed to do and finish at work, your videos are going to be a little bit late, but don't worry, you're gonna have basically the whole week to complete the task. So this material is fundamental for you to watch because you're gonna have to complete some activities with both videos, this one and also the second part. The third part, that is the writers of verse, that is going to be the following video that I'm going to share with you. Once you watch the video, we're going to basically go to the activity section, click on the link that is going to be there, and you're going to complete the task that is basically there. All right, so we're gonna start. I'm going to stop sharing my video and I'm going to share my screen. Hold on. All right, as I said before, writers of prose, that's the topic for today. I apologize because of the noise that it's outside. Yes, so we're gonna talk about some writers of prose, as I said before, one more time. I said it multiple times. But the first one is going to be Washington Irving. Washington Irving, this guy is very interesting. You might not recognize him, and you may not recognize the name, but definitely you're gonna recognize some of his stories. He was very important. He was involved in creating an autonomous American style about people, places, and things that are purely American. And this is what we were discussing in the previous session, the background. That's something that what makes us unique. And he was the first one to set this mold. And here's a picture of him. A very jovial fellow. And he's very diverse in careers. He wrote about a lot of things. And basically, we're gonna take a look at some of the things that he wrote about. So we're gonna move on to this one. Hold on, let me, yes, can I do full screen? Yeah, this one is better, I think so. So he wrote on a range of subjects on topography. And topography, three major topics that he wrote about are New York State, Christopher Columbus, and the West of America. And this covers a lot of different territory. Why will he write about Christopher Columbus? You might wonder at this point, because perhaps like he has some like interest in the founding of America, and that's why he started writing about Christopher Columbus and all of the things that are related to the Spanish. So he's best known for his stories on Rip Van Winkle and the Legend of the Sleepy Hollow. Probably you're more familiar with the Legend of the Sleepy Hollow that appear in the sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon. Yes, so Geoffrey Crayon, you have the date over there. These are stories that are brought about to the youth and are very enticing sometimes. The legend, for example, the legend of Sleepy Hollow with the headless horseman, as you can see in the picture in here. It's kind of curious because, like in the case of Rip Van Winkle, the story is interesting. And because it takes place in the Catskill Mountains. Especially in the case of the Sleepy Hollow, it's got a lot of action in it and it's got a lot of tension. And I consider it has a great narrative and it's something very different. So when you think about romanticism, don't think about the idealism of, and we said this precedent and we said this definition that not necessarily when you think about romanticism, that is the romantic period, it's all about love and romance. It's about basically, you know, like from the previous video, you may recall that it's about the essence of America and what makes America unique. So yes, as I said before, it's got a lot of tension in here, a lot of action. There are a lot of movies. There's a movie with Johnny Depp for this book, the adaptation of the book, and also there is a TV show for the adaptation of this, the Sleepy Hollow. Yes, so probably you're familiar with it, you have heard of it, and if you want to read it, that will be a very nice recommendation. Now, if we go back and think about, for example, Rip Van Winkle, that is the other book that he wrote. We're gonna take a look to Rip Van Winkle. If you think about him, his story is still interesting as the Sleepy Hollow, because it's about a guy and he lives up in the mountains and he's kind of lazy and he likes to run errands for some of the local women. And basically he's up at some point, he's up in the woods one day and he falls asleep after giving some drink from this man up in the mountains. So basically he was drunk. That's what I wanted to say. He was drunk at some point in the mountains and he falls asleep and wakes up 20 years later. And he wakes up and he goes back to where he was. And he was in the mountains and goes back and he finds his daughter with a child and his son, which is crazy. And he's like, what's going on? What the hell? He finds out that his son just like him, and he's kind of picks up where he left off there. And that's basically the whole story about because of time. But this is a like recommendation, guys, that I will suggest you to read and to know about. The Sleepy Hollow is basically a classic. And then you have the story of Rip Van Winkle. And kind of reminds me to travel to the future. Back to the Future, that's the movie, right? So when he wakes up, he sleeps through the Revolutionary War and through the founding of the new government, which basically it's a comparison of the Americans. And Washington Irving is saying, okay, so the American people are finally waking up from the previous experience that we had and discovering this new life. So the story of Rip Van Winkle is this parallelism where he's comparing, okay, he goes into a deep sleep of 20 years, Rip Van Winkle, and then America's, it's basically comparing, saying, okay, they finally wake up after 20 years and after the previous experience that we have. So yes, so in addition to this book, he wrote some satirical work as well. Remember that we were talking about satirical works previously? And he did it at the beginning of his career. He wrote in a literary magazine, Salma Gandhi, with his brother and a colleague. This was at the beginning of the 19th century. It was a satirical viewpoint about life and politics of New York. Remember the three main topics that he wrote about is New York, the New York State, and then the West, well, also Spain. So he was writing more about New York, and the Catskill Mountains are in New York, and he was writing about New York City. But it's kind of curious because it was here that he gave New York City the name Gotham. If that sounds familiar, Gotham City, DC Comics, Batman. What superhero is that about? Yeah, Batman, right? Or Superman. No, Gotham is about Batman. So he also wrote a story of New York from the beginning of the war, and we're gonna move it here. So he also wrote this story of New York from the beginning of the war to the end of the Dutch dynasty. And it's basically by Dietrich Knickerbocker in 1809. It's his first major book, which was another satirical work about New York. So it's quite interesting. He actually wrote the book. But put up this fictitious name, Knickerbocker, which helped him earn notoriety. Yeah, if I remember correctly, he put up a missing person report on this fellow, Knickerbocker, and the whole city was curious about who is this fella, where can we find him, and then it was eventually discovered that it was Washington Irving all the time. It was like a pseudonym that he used for writing this work. So this helped him gain notoriety for a particular work. And today the word Knickerbocker sometimes used for New Yorker. So Knickerbockers sometimes is used for New Yorkers, or as some people might say, New Yorker. Yes, so that's a funny and interesting fact over there that he used a pseudonym for writing this. So, but Irving also known for his work on Spain. He wrote a biography of Christopher Columbus and other works about Granada and the Alhambra. The Alhambra is in Andalusia in the south of Spain. It's a beautiful, huge architectural structure from the era of the Moorish. He was appointed the minister of Spain and spent many years there during the tumultuous 19th century of the Iberian Peninsula. The Iberian Peninsula, it's another word for the peninsula on which Spain and Portugal are found. So in case you're wondering what is the Iberian Peninsula, it basically this peninsula that includes Portugal and Spain. So basically, this left him disheartened in which to return home because of the tumultuous 19th century and the problems that were happening in the Iberian Peninsula. One more time, Spain and Portugal. So Spain at this time is going through a lot of political upheaval, which was in stark contrast with the development of the United States. So while Spain was convulsionating, basically the United States were flourishing. Yes, so things were developing over there in Spain. Things that have developed in the country was founded, and it was concrete and from a very straight point of view. So you have someone that is basically helping the Americas to forge an identity. And this is something that we were discussing in the previous session. But in Spain, all the tumultuous coming back and forth with the different dynasties and the monarchies were very confusing for him. And remember, he was like a minister of international relations, something like that, like the equivalent in Spain. So he didn't like it. He went back to the United States, Washington Irving. We're talking about Washington Irving here. He was a little bit disheartened when he came back, as I said before. But in addition to the biography on Columbus, he also wrote about George Washington, Muhammad, and Oliver Goldsmith. So those are another biographies and pieces of biographical work. I'm sorry for that confusion. So he's basically writing a lot of biographies, and you can see here that in the 1830s he also wrote about the American West, such as the adventures of Captain Bone Mill and a tour of the prairies. Some believe that he wrote this in response to those who criticized his European trips and interests. For example, the thought was basically that if he writes about New York and then he leaves and then comes back to New York, remember that he was writing about New York and then he moved to the peninsula, Iberian Peninsula, and then he didn't like it over there. He moved back to the United States. So he's saying, oh, you went away and you're not really founded in what's happening in here, so you have no idea. So that's why he decided to move on from the topic of discussion, and he wrote about the West, which is excellent because he wrote about the West and he wrote about New York State and he wrote about a lot of things in a lot of different biographies. Muhammad, that's an extension also. So Christopher Columbus, he did a lot of research when he was over in Spain too about that. So he wanted to write about Christopher Columbus. So he moved to Spain and he did some research, something that you guys should do. Not specifically on Christopher Columbus, but in general about any topic. He was very curious about the starting of the Americas. He was a scholar, diverse writer, definitely important people in the founding of what is American. So he was trying to help to identify or what makes American literature unique, or what makes America unique. So the second guy is James Fenimore Cooper, and some of you already talk about this guy. So we're not gonna stop a lot on this guy. He wrote a lot about the West and about the Navy. He was in the Navy. His first work was The Spy, about the country espionage during the Revolutionary War. Now you can see the day here, it's 1820. And that's important because we're kind of looking back now, and this whole idea of nostalgia, looking back on the beginnings again. Remember, we looked at this before, the way that some Puritans were looking back just 80 years afterwards when we talk about like the Scarlet Letters. So looking back nostalgically about their arrival to the New World. So that's what these people are doing in here. Um, so here we got some kind of like a picture of him. So you can appreciate, I think it's a photograph. Um, so he's got some ideas here about the espionage during the Revolutionary War. Yes, basically he's kind of like retelling the stories of the Revolutionary War. Looks like pretty much like a black and white painting back here. Like we didn't have the color thing, so it's black and white. So let's move on. So he's most famous for the book The Deer Slayer and The Last of the Mohicans, both which were made movies in the 20th century. The Deer Slayer, it's been adapted to multiple times, a number of times. Have you ever seen any of these movies? The Last of the Mohicans or The Deer Slayer? Let me know, please, and in a chat conversation, you can tell me like, yeah, mister, I have seen it before. Or not, teacher, I have no idea what you're talking about. So we're gonna move on, but basically like these two books appear in the Leatherstocking series, basically there are a series of 5 historical novels about the difficulties of Native Americans with the new country. And the interactions are it's kind of imposing a lot of the ideas onto the Native Americans. So adapting some of the struggles, some of the interactions, and the developments that we can see as the nation is progressing. Yes. So here's one of the paintings from the covers of historical novels. You can see here it's kind of got that idea that I was mentioning before. We've seen this a number of times before about Native Americans taking away somebody in captivity. And this is the typical portrayal of Americans, the white people about the Native Americans. So now let's take a look at George Washington Harris. He's another writer, Antebellum. Antebellum is a pre-Civil War humorist. He wrote about the life in the South. So like I said before, it's kind of important to look at different geographical parts of the United States because basically we're looking for the identity of the United States. And we have these writers that are basically talking, giving us the notion of different parts. We already talk about the New York state, and now we're moving a little bit more to the South. Yes, so when we talk about with Washington Irving, we talk about the Catskill Mountains in New York, and then New York, and then, well, the Syria area, that's what I'm talking about. And then we covered the West, and now we're going down to the South. So his most famous character is Sod Lovingood. He's a poorly educated Appalachian fella who took joy in lies and tricking others. But this is interesting because it was written in the characteristics of an exaggerated Southern dialect. I suggest that you Google this, Southern dialects or dialects in general in the United States. Because one thing is the language, you have mostly English, but it's spoken different languages over there, but other thing is dialects among English. So if you want to expand a little bit more on that, so you can perfectly Google it. So let's take a look at some of the different types of writing styles that this author has, especially this one in general, because it's interesting to see how this style of writing in dialect, developing literature, and how people purposely wrote specific ways to imitate the way people spoke. So he was very influential for other writers of the South, such as Mark Twain and William Faulkner. So probably you're familiar with Mark Twain. We'll take a look at these writers later on, but it's very interesting to see how some people basically influence other, and and this is very common in literature. Before we were talking about the Americans and other writers also copying people from Europe. Remember during this period we said basically everybody is copying everybody, but it's not necessarily copying the way that they're doing it. It's just taking inspiration of their writing style. And now we have the last guy, that is Thomas Bangstorp. It's another antebellum writer of the South. So here's a picture of this guy. So this is definitely a photograph. They're really photographed and daguerreotypes. This is ways daguerreotypes of photograph. I had to sit there for a real long time for the picture to come out, but nice and clear. So that's the way of doing pictures. And now we basically take multiple selfies per second. Anyways, so he's most known for his short story, The Big Bear of Arkansas. It's about the character Jim Doggett, who hyperbolically explains the superiority of Arkansas, though a series of tall tales and anecdotes. So hyperbolically means exaggerating. Hyperbole, it's an exaggeration. So he's exaggerating the superiority of Arkansas through a series of tales and anecdotes. So basically, he also wrote the Masters of House in 1854. It's an anti-slavery novel. It's not acerbic in its criticism of slavery. It may even come across as ambivalent to some readers, but it does pose itself as a milder version of Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Harriet Beecher Stowe, I'm sorry. That was published 2 years earlier. So this is basically, guys, everything for this part. You're gonna have this material, and this is going to be very important. This video is going to be a supporting video, but you're going to have the materials, and it's going to help you. Or you can go on Google or watch videos for these specific writers. I wanted to bring like some specific details, but the most important information as well about each of them, so you get a notion of these parts. And you're gonna have an activity to complete. This material is going to be ready for you later on today.